Thank you to people who've responded in the chat. It's good to feel that there's people listening. I've had a hello from Ben, from Rodrigo, from Delia. Is anyone else out there? Let's just see. It's 16 minutes in. Other people, if you wouldn't mind just using the chat so I can tell that you're functioning in the space, that's great. It's just so that I can get a feeling of kind of the audience and brilliant. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great little acknowledgement in the virtual world. If you have any problems with sound or anything, let me know. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up from where we were last time, and I'm going to quickly recap that because I think that will be helpful. So the first thing is to just say that what we did last time is that we were looking at this agenda here, which is the mode A teaching. Mode A teaching and recognizing there's a mode B, which is really what I want to focus on more today. And within that, we had an agenda which is to do with what does the research say and Rosenshine's principles. And I think we got through most of this, but we didn't quite get to the final stages to do with practice. But so I'm going to quickly recap that. What we were looking at Rosenshine's principles instruction and how useful that can be in an RE context, starting with this idea of retrieval. So here I am now sort of acting some of this out. So some of you who are on this call before, or if you're watching the video and this is the second video having watched the first one, what we're doing now is I'm sort of activating your prior knowledge. You've got a prior recall of some of the things we talked about last week, but it's a whole week ago, so it's going to be fuzzy. And by getting you to think about it, now if you were in my class and this was a slightly in-person thing, or we had protocols of everyone being on camera and it was that type of thing, I'd be saying, like, turn to your partner or make a list. What were the main things you thought about last week? I could ask you some questions like, what were some of the examples that we gave around retrieval practice? How would you use a knowledge organizer? What were some of the questioning techniques? And I would make you think about those things to get you activating that prior knowledge. I can't just assume that there you are with me, like bam, straight in my head and knowing what I'm thinking about. I have to get you thinking about that stuff, and you'll have all sorts of memories from last session, which we now have to activate. And there are a number of ways to do that: through quizzing, through a task, through questions, and through discussion, or through mapping, sort of visualizing. There's lots of different ways of activating prior knowledge. And we talked about if we don't do that, then students aren't consciously processing the information. We're not helping them focus their attention on the key things now. So this is part of a whole retrieval practice sort of situation. And so we talked a bit about that. We also talked about, we used the example of Henry VIII's wives and how, not that the story of Henry VIII's wives is a story. It's a narrative. It's got all sorts of classic features of narratives. It's got characters, it's got conflict, it's got cause and effect. It's got, it's got all sorts of aspects of good stories. It's got a structure, beginning, middle, and end sort of thing. So it's got narrative flow. It's also got a context. Where was it set? All those sorts of things. So just like any story, that story is a story you can tell, and embedded in the story are facts, the knowledge. So the knowledge which could be written down, the declarative knowledge, these are the things that you should know, that you may or may not remember. But in order to build that knowledge, we've got to start thinking about how do we build knowledge. And the example we were talking about that, sequencing concepts and modeling. This is what Rosenshine is saying. In the context of RE, we talked about, say, Hinduism and how the images, the things you select, the bits of knowledge you emphasize are big choices to make on a journey towards understanding what Hinduism is and what it means to people. And you've got to make a choice about the path through that. And before you can expect students to remember things, you've got to have sort of got them to build a schema for it, which has got some relevance, some meaning, some context, or else it's just sort of deconstructed facts. And you could remember off by heart, like in that list, Dharma, Artha, Karma, Moksha. those could be words, those could be sounds, they could be dibble, dobble, jibble, jabble, and meet with no meaning whatsoever, unless we construct meaning for the students through discussing, so that dharma, the sense of ethic, duty, has a meaning. We can relate to that concept in our world. If I'm a non-Hindu person, I can relate to that through another example, and I can then connect it to this idea. But the word dharma is just sound unless it has meaning, and I have to build that meaning for every student. So I've got to work hard to connect students to the knowledge, and later I can do a quiz on what does dharma mean and what does karma mean, because it's already something they know, and you've got to build the knowledge in steps. So this sequencing concepts and small steps is key. We talked about models. So how do we build successful writing? Well, we need model bits of writing, and we looked at, say, if you've got a model exam question in RE, you start saying, well, why is it good? We've got to model a specific example to look at, and then the need to sort of break things down and scaffold so the students can be successful. We don't just say, go off and have a go, and it's not very good. Okay, have another go. You sort of make them succeed. So there's 4 marks for that question. So students should feel it's like to get 4 marks. And some students might need to be given all the words, the terms and the concepts, and say, I put these concepts into a structured paragraph so that you've got the 4 marks, and that's the scaffold. Some of them might need to have the structure there, but then they're supposed to remember the key details. So I've got a pre-structured paragraph right here. What's the knowledge you're supposed to have to insert? And so they have to sort of generate that, and you build up to them be able to write freely from the beginning and knowing how to say things. So scaffolding writing is big. Questioning. Now, I'll remind you of the questioning techniques. Ideally, you'd be able to define all of those, and questioning in RE is rich with possibilities in terms of probing questioning, getting students to get deeply into sharing their ideas, their understanding, their perspectives. And pair share is probably going to be a big part of discussion, because you're going to have students who are, I call it the washing hands of learning, because it's something which, if you do a lot, like washing hands, it leads to great, it has a big impact. Now, when you're trying to get students to share perspectives, the maximum efficiency for getting a group of students to talk about their ideas is in pairs. If you do it in groups of 3 and 4, you have to have extra layers of structure of who talks, how you share, and you can't just do that half-heartedly. You've got to have structure. So group discussions can work, but only if there's structure to the way you organize who speaks. So it's not just a few people dominating the others. But pair share is a great technique because it gets everybody talking, and then you sample the answers by cold calling them, and you're hearing what students think and say. And I'll show you some examples of that towards the end, which is much more profound. So the repertoire of question techniques, there isn't one set, but once you've got defined techniques like check for understanding or cold calling, and you know what they are, then you can start saying, like, are we doing this well? Are we giving enough thinking time? Are we listening to what students say? I think this is one of the biggest weaknesses in teaching. I really do. And when we talk about mode B teaching, are you listening to what students are saying, ready to engage with it so that you can deepen their knowledge? Or are you just hoping they say the thing you were expecting and then move on? And that's where really deep thinking comes in. So someone posits an opinion, your immediate response is to say, that's interesting, why did you say that? Or do you think that's always true? Can you think of any examples where that's not true? Okay, we need to sort of manage the muting here. I don't know if we can do that. Just going to just check that we've got the power to mute here. Thank you. So these are some of the things that we've been discussing. That in the previous section, and it all links into the mode B. So you need to have these things going well. If you're good at cold calling, if you're good at making sure everyone feels involved in the conversation, if you're confident with pair share, and you're used to getting students to share their ideas and then pull them around, you get really a great discursive classroom. And if we're talking about expressing ideas in religious education, we've got to be able to police that a little bit. Now we need to find the territory. Now, one of the stories on my blog, you'll read, if you want to search this, I haven't got it to show you, but there's a story I wrote about when I taught RE. I had to cover a year 11 GCSE for a year. And one of the questions, which was the GCSE exam question that came up, was, which we had in a kind of mock exam. I was quite horrified by this. Was some Christians believe that homosexuality is a sin. Do you agree or disagree? And that was literally an AQA exam question, which I thought was an absolute outrage, because what was happening was students were writing basically homophobic diatribes and thinking that was legitimate because the question said, do you agree or disagree? And we were basically invited students into this pit of sharing kind of toxic homophobia because they were invited to. And I thought that was poor. So, but when you have a group discussion about a sensitive issue, how do you know that isn't happening there? And that what the students are thinking about is kind of opinions which are problematic to your culture and your school, and ones you kind of want to flush out, because and this is your opportunity to sort of get students to think. This is one of the big values of RE. We actually have a place where we have to say, well, come on, we can't just suppress opinion maybe, but we have to have some boundaries. Like if I'm a gay student, I don't want to sit in a lesson where students can debate my existence and whether I have a legitimate right to my sexuality. That's an absolute disgrace to put a student in that situation. So we don't debate that. We have a school position which says being gay is normal and natural and commonplace, and has equal rights to someone who's heterosexual, and that's the way the world is. That's our position. So when you've got pair share, you've got to make sure you haven't created little sort of pockets of sort of sharing of views which are not acceptable. And you have to replace that with talking about racism, and you see it's immediately the same. So when you're doing pair discussion, you've got to get in amongst it. You've got to have ground rules for RE, you've got to have ground rules, and you've got to have policing. You've got to circulate. So you've got to get in amongst and find out what students are saying and thinking and challenge them. This is the opportunity to do that. So I do think it's important. And the questions you set have clearly not to invite students into this sort of cul-de-sac of thinking, this is my legitimate opportunity to express my prejudice. No, it isn't. And I think that's a position you need to discuss. I mean, you might have a different view of that, but that's mine. And I think having had that experience, you need to be careful. And you can discuss that when you get into your groups. So this is part of the pair share. Discursive classrooms are brilliant for religious education, but they need to be managed properly and they need to be policed so that you can maintain the boundaries of principle and protection of people's rights. I don't think you can be too casual about that. And therefore you need to think it through. The other thing that we talked about briefly towards the end was about the reviewing material. So you've got some knowledge that students are supposed to have. And of course, there are some factual things that people are supposed to understand about a particular faith or a particular ethical position, and definitions of things and what people say, quotations that we use to reference texts, factual knowledge about the history of or whatever, as well as the personal reflection aspect, which is more rehearsal of kind of positions. And I think that's useful. So for example, if I have a way of explaining my position, which is, do I think, for example, that genetically modified crops, as the example I gave last week, is ethically acceptable? That's something I can practice. If I have to sort of demonstrate that knowledge in any kind of high stakes situation, if I've rehearsed that argument a few times, I'm actually more comfortable giving that, and I can maybe contrast it with another opinion more fluently than if I've only sort of once tentatively given that case, So you can practice expressing even your own perspective. It doesn't have to be practice just about facts. It can be practice and retrieval around the kind of typical types of arguments that people make. So when we're looking at this, practice and beliefs, bringing them back in to weaving them together, the more fluent I am with being able to say that a Christian view of creation might be based on the Old Testament Genesis, and we can discuss whether that's supposed to be, we can discuss whether or not, a creationist, it would literally believe that was true, whereas, it could be a kind of just a metaphorical and everything. But to have that debate, to know that that's actually a direct quote from Genesis is power, isn't it? So knowing that Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth means X. That's a useful thing to have. So we select the quotations for recall so that we can have arguments and discussions, not just so that we can answer the question when it comes up on the pub quiz. And I do think that's an important distinction to make in the student's mind, to give purpose to recall in an RE context. It's to build our capacity to explore, argue, contrast opinions, and to be knowledgeable about texts, so that when we say Hindus believe X, we've got some basis for saying that. We don't just say, well, I'm just telling you. No, we can say, well, for example, here's a quotation. So that's the reason. So giving a rationale is key. So without rehearsing everything again, the practice slide then is, like, what things can you practice? One of the things I think is an interesting idea, Rosenshine says, is that students get better at doing things with practice, but sometimes you have to guide the practice so that students are successful, and then withdraw the guidance so that they can do it on their own. And the analogy I often use is this from football. The trap and pass, what's your equivalent of this in religious education? It is a ridiculous question, doesn't it? But there is this. What sorts of things do you do a lot, which you then can weave together in a more complex situation like writing an essay? And there are things to do with writing, expressing opinions, on the other hand. And so many standard, say, GCSE style questions have this feeling of contrasting opinions. So you can practice contrasting opinions so that students get in the habit of always thinking of, but there must be another perspective. An alternative perspective might be, and also to get into the habit of, and I mentioned this last week, of avoiding the trap of saying all Christians believe X. That is never true, almost never true. Some Christians believe, whereas others believe. Some, whereas others. Some, whereas others. Some, whereas others. And you practice that, and you always have to think to fit that in. Now, if that becomes a routine in your head, you're thinking, what's the whereas others? There must be a whereas others, because that's always true. So what are the different opinions that are expressed within a particular group? And if you get the habit of always thinking around in those terms, then you get deeper thinking rather than the kind of the false picture of binaries between everyone thinks this, everyone thinks that. And so habits, and it's a really good thing to think about, is what sorts of fluency can we build around some key structures in writing or comparing opinions. So there's lots to do with that. Within that, then, you've got this dilemma. You've got mixed ability groups, you've got mixed attainment groups, mixed prior knowledge groups, however you want to frame it. Now, some students, this is my skateboarding analogy, which I don't think we talked about last week, the skateboarding analogy. Now, what does this mean? If you take a group of children down to the skate park and you think they all need you to start with the big safety briefing and saying, right, everybody line up, everybody put your helmet on, pads on, let me show you as the teacher how to do a 180. It's going to be pretty embarrassing and frustrating to the students who can already do that and do it without your help. In fact, you're kind of getting in their way because they are resenting it, and also it's kind of stopping them learning more because there's this kind of expert reversal. It's hard to even listen to somebody who's telling you something you already know. We all experience that in different ways. You might be experiencing it now, for all I know, but that's just natural. So we've got to anticipate that some of the students are ready to do something else. So part of your planning has got to be like, who needs what? And some students need to practice independently, which means without guidance, because they're ready to. They're practicing the things that we guided them to do, but they may have different departure points within the same goal. So we're not lowering our goals. We do not have all must some learning objectives or whatever those sort of silly things are. Everyone is trying to learn to use the skate rail here. It's just that you're ready to practice it independently now, whereas you guys need a bit more guided support. That's the difference. The differentiation in that sense doesn't mean I'm only expecting you lot to do this. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I want you all to aspire to do this. Some of you need to practice these tasks because you're ready. Some of you need to practice these tasks because you still need to build up your fluency, and that's fine. So what are those things? What does that look like in RE? Well, it can be around writing, it can be around expressing opinions. Sometimes you need to scaffold discussion. So some students, I've seen this brilliantly well, scaffolded talk in a lesson where the prop is a scaffold for talk that the students are using to structure their discussion so that they've got a go-to source, and that is the nature of the scaffold. Sometimes it's scaffolding for writing, like writing prompts like this, scaffolding writing. And sometimes it's the knowledge organizers, like the Hindu knowledge organizer. A scaffold could be like have a discussion, but with the knowledge organizer to prompt your discussion. Whereas other students do not need that. And you're actually saying, no, I don't want you to use that. I want you to just go off your recall. It depends where your students are at. So what we're trying to do is avoid anyone floundering and feeling I'm rubbish at this, I can't do it. And avoiding anyone feeling, God, you're holding me back because I'm ready for more and you're making me feel like you're getting in my way. And that is the sweet spot of teaching, and it's easier said than done. So you have to find your way with a particular class. Sometimes it is a bit like juggling and a bit like gardening, and sometimes it's just how teaching feels to be saying, okay, you lot, I need you to do this, and whereas you lot, you need to do this. And you do have a kind of a sort of twin track approach. Sometimes you do need to do that. Ideally, you're keeping everyone together as much as possible, but you have a structured task which says, right, get to this threshold, and when you're there, off you go. When you're there, off you go, and here's instructions. But let's make sure you can all do that, meet that threshold. And that's a good way of keeping people together. Like we're all going to go to the threshold point together, but when you're ready, off you go. And if you're not quite sure, we're still going to consolidate first. If you don't scaffold the discussion, you have some students dominate and other students don't know what to say, they don't know how to say it, and they don't feel they can contribute. But you've got to try and make it feel everyone can contribute. So scaffolding discussion in RE, I think, is really, really vital. Sometimes it's about rehearsing the phrases. So you've taught these types of structures. This comes in English literature, but we build them to fluency. So both, however, whereas that structure, we've introduced it, but we have to sort of rehearse it. And then the practicing explaining. So here's one which comes from, I know the environment features in a lot of syllabuses now because we talk about stewardship and so on. But from a factual knowledge point of view, say here with a geography example, if I can just use a geography example, how good are you at explaining that we need a reference point? You need a tool to evaluate. So you have to give students tools to evaluate how well they've done. So can you explain the advantages and disadvantages of a wind farm? Well, have a go and then see how well you did. And then you can maybe use pairs to check each other's so that everyone is talking. Right, now have another go. Right, see if you can include more of that detail. Structure your argument more, advantages, then disadvantages, and then in conclusion, that type of thing. Right, have another go. Right, did you include all of those? Reference it. And it's like practice. Now, practice loops, you need to find them. It's a good question to ask yourself. Where in my lessons do I get students into a practice loop? Where in my lessons can we in some iterative way. Now, one of my favorite lessons I've seen done, which was in a school where this was told, was the students had to give a presentation. Now, let's say it was about an RE question to do with, to what extent do you agree with, the position vegans take in relation to animal welfare and the kind of and not eating meat on moral grounds rather than environmental grounds. To what extent do you agree with that? And the fact they even include dairy products and not just animals that are killed. So that's the discussion. Why are vegans, what sort of make a point further than the vegetarians do? It's a really good discussion. Let's imagine that. Now, you need to imagine a student who's trying to formulate that argument. They do a reasonable job. They've covered a couple of issues. You've got a few other things to throw at them to see if they can explore it. You hear their argument. Now, I've seen a great lesson where this is the type of thing they were doing. All the students had to prepare their case to explain why vegans take this position. They heard each other's presentations, and the teacher just said to them, right, you've heard each other's, go back to your table and refine your argument and do it again. And they did the same presentations again in the same lesson. It's so good. I've seen that done in a few contexts, and this is a particular type of thing. The second argument is better than the first because they've heard the other people's and they've understood how it feels to hear a case being made. If there were some factual errors, the teacher would correct them and say, no, that's not actually true. So you don't just let the students talk nonsense. But then the second go. Now, how often do you give your students a second go to explain a difficult concept? It's not that common to see, but it's really powerful when you do it. And then they're in a really good position to write that out. And you might say it takes time. Yeah, but not that much more time. You'd be surprised. And the depth of reasoning you're developing in doing that is quite significant. It doesn't have to be written down. Well, sometimes teachers say to me, but that takes time. And what literally someone said to me recently, but what if SLT come and there's nothing written in their books? I just think, look, I can't legislate for your SLT needing stuff written in books. I'm interested in whether students understand things or not. And rehearsing an explanation can be a much more productive use of their time than writing stuff in their book that they don't really understand. And you've got to pick your battles, haven't you? So of course, there's some writing, some really good writing actually, but there's also time to reflect and practice. So let's not sort of see these things as in opposition because they're not. So there we go. I mean, that's really the kind of, I mean, I'm picking that up because it feeds into the mode B, the retrieval practice stuff. Now, so Rosenshine's principles, if we take stock, reviewing material regularly, asking lots of questions and checking for understanding, new material in small steps, and then practice is a great menu of things. But it's not a checklist. This is my little bit of PowerPoint animation, if it's coming through the Wi-Fi pipe to you. It's not a checklist. It's not like you go into lessons and say, I need to see this, I need to see that. It's not about whether you do them or not. Everyone does all of these things to some extent. It's about how well you do them. And it's so important to stress that. It's about how well you do them. And I know I'm repeating myself from last week. Okay, so there we go. Now, if you were watching this on video, I would say pause now and like take stock to reflect. So now, you might stop and reflect on this call. Which of these things do you feel in your practice you need to focus your attention? Is it students forgetting things, so therefore we need to build in more review? Is it the depth of knowledge when they bring to write an essay is poor, so we need to build the review into a writing task? Is it sort of questioning? Is it that when students are discussing ideas, we've got a lot of shy students who don't really contribute, and when they do, it's kind of always a bit tentative? Well, then your questioning is the thing to focus on. Probing, questioning, putting students in, modeling how to structure a good argument. Is it that they just really don't get it, like at a conceptual level? So have you built the sequence of concepts well enough to build a foundation? Have you gone right back down to their core knowledge? Have you scaffolded the tasks? Have you shown them what excellence looks like? And then do you get them to practice? No one is good at anything. No one, sorry, someone's banging around it. No one is good at anything the first time. And no one gets good at anything by being left to go and dump and run. Off you go. You get good at doing things by supported, guided practice, and then independent practice that follows. And the truth is that some students will be ready to practice independently before others, and that is the nature of learning. So there you go, that's your menu. Have a reflection about where you are with that. At any point now, by the way, if you want to put something in the chat about this and say, know where you are, or just say this is a question, this would be a good time to do that. So the next thing though, so I'm waiting for questions in the chat. I'm not going to mandate that because I know people, want to engage with this in lots of different ways, and you might just be quite happy listening to me. But please, I'll just remind you that that's there. I will get you all talking in a minute. Now, the next thing then, this all fits in a wider context. Mode A teaching is partnered with Mode B teaching. Now, Mode A teaching is what we looked at with Rosenshine's principles, but now we're going to look at Mode B teaching. So at this point, I'm going to introduce you to another analogy which you may be aware of. There's a question. Yeah, so someone's asked me a question. Do I think the essay writing argument tasks could fit the primary context? Yes. Some of my favorite work that I've seen in RE is in a primary context at Key Stage 2, where they call it essays. They actually say, this is what we do here, we write essays. And on the content, so just say it's a straightforward Christian parable thing, like here's a parable and what does it mean? Here's a parable. What is it supposed to be telling us? Say the Good Samaritan. What's the moral of the story in the Good Samaritan? And something like, do you feel like you behave in this way or not? And that kind of personal reflection. It turns into an essay. I've seen that done really well. And teachers do make it that. So they write it out in full. Arguments, though, you need to get students to debate things they can debate with knowledge. The worst thing you can do in a primary context, in my opinion, is encourage debate when the students do not have the knowledge to have that debate. It's false, it's shallow, and it's risky. So we don't debate things where the knowledge base is not there, like to do with anything to do with some more technical issues. But it could be to do with things like kindness or unfairness or justice, and you'll know this better than me probably, but there are so many topics which are relevant to their lives, and whether stories that spin off from books they've read about whether someone was treated badly or not, or all the Bible stories and other faith stories. So definitely the same issues, practicing and so on, are really, really, really important in a primary school context. Yeah, so I feel like it's very relevant, and I know my own children used to do quite a lot of that at primary school, was writing down their views about things which they had the capacity to do. So I think it's worth constructing things people can take a view of. Is it right that? Is it fair if? Here's a position, do you agree or disagree? But about things which are in their world that they can relate to, so they can form a legitimate view based on their knowledge. As soon as you've got students sort of saying, do I agree with vaccination? Yes or no? And they have no idea. It's an absolute car crash. So we need to be really careful. But, we don't just pretend to have opinions. We have to have opinions which we can justify based on our experience. So far, although I might have used some secondary examples, nearly everything I'm saying, I think, applies to primary and secondary. In this Mode B teaching, so here's in Mode A, let's just take stock of this again. Mode A teaching, this is you, the leader of the whole process. I'm the teacher, I know more than you, I'm explaining stuff, I'm modeling it to you, I'm getting you to practice, I'm giving you feedback. And that is strongly important for every teacher at some point. For some teachers, it's most of what they do every day. But the thing is, there are other things. You can ask students to go and find and brilliantly well if you structure the task. Sometimes you do want students to feel and do things organically. And yes, you do want that, because if you don't, it's pretty tedious without you doing that. So I feel like it's important to try to see that teaching can be more than instructional, and in fact needs to be, if you're really serious about getting students to I'm just conscious of this. I can't really see. I'm sorry to interrupt this, but there's a kind of sound on thing. If we could just address the issue of someone being not muted, and the kind of whispering sound all the way through. I think it might be Debbie's thing. I'm going to mute you. Sorry, it's just distracted me, and I can't do that. I don't know if someone else can do that for me, but Debbie Norton, can we mute you? It says that. Okay, so hands-on experiences, things that students do with their hands, making things, doing things, open-ended tasks. And this is what we're going to get into now. So once we've got a solid core of you being the instructional lead, the rest of the stuff can be magic. It can really light the fire. And it's the blend of them that I think that's so exciting, and why teaching can be so great, because you can build the students' capacity to do some amazing things. And I'm going to show you all about that. And it fits in with my philosophy of rainforest thinking, that we don't want everything to be a plantation. It's not like do this, do that, do this, do that, make one of these, write exactly this, have this opinion. Nightmare. You can't just inject your opinions into students' heads. You can't fill their heads with your cultural values. You can't impose on them your worldview. You can't even make them believe in any faith or no faith. They have to come to those discussions themselves. So standard issue teaching only goes so far. We need to be more rainforest, which means we need to allow students to flourish in a range of ways and embrace that and say, right, what are the different ways you can express this opinion? What are the different ways that you can actually, sorry, it's difficult circumstances banging behind me here. And I think if you don't have that mindset, you cut off all sorts of possibilities. So we need to work out how to do it. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So, for example, the first thing is we need to sort of remember that we have values. We have things we care about. We have things we care about. Here's some things that happened when I was the head of a grammar school, which isn't very far from here. I'm in Colchester, so this is in Chelmsford. Here's some things that I thought were great. And I took pictures of them to say, I think these things are great. Now, why did I think they were good? Here, top left, you've got students doing a group presentation. And I loved it because it was very, very rigorous. I don't mean that. This is the Global Perspectives course. These students, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, had to work in a group. Now that's tough, isn't it? They were tutored by this person here who's now a head teacher. And here we have it. They were mentored by a student in the year above. So you've got a year 13 student mentoring a group of 6 year 12s in the Global Perspectives assessment. He did it the year before. He knew what they needed to do. And they needed to give a presentation about this topic. And it had to be written as a kind of assignment, but then it had to be grilled on it as a Viva style assessment, which is part of the assessed qualification. And each one of the students in the group needed to be able to field any of the questions that were asked. So in other words, they couldn't just sort of specialize and say, I'll do this, you do that, you do this, and divide it up. They had to make sure any one of the team was ready for the question on that, ready for the question on this, ready to explain why they made this conclusion. And so they had to spend their time making sure that they could all understand the stuff. So there's an extensive collaborative process which led into this. So they had to work and spend time together for hours, mostly in their spare time. But the point is this, the structure of the task made them collaborate. And so they had to support each other in the learning, which meant they learned more by doing it together than if they had done it on their own. And that is the golden rule for a group task. Would they learn more by doing it together than by doing it on their own? And if the answer is not a firm yes, then you should be making them do it on their own. And this was a classic example, really strong. Here you've got a food tech lesson, which why would I take that picture? Well, it's because here the teacher was teaching them to do something really precise. He didn't say, go off and design a pizza and have fun with it. He was saying, make this pizza, make it exactly like I've shown you and do it properly and make it really good. Now, why do I value that? Because that taught them the skills that they needed. Now, later, they'll roll up to year 9, year 10. Then they're creating, then they're inventing, then they're making recipes which are really good. Why? Because they can, because they know how to do things. Now, that means in some aspects of teaching, you need to be direct. You need to be saying, do this, do that, do it just like I've said, do it precisely like this, because this is going to help you to be more creative later. And you need to be ready to make that choice. It's not all about a lovely, buzzy, everyone being creative. If actually they're not developing the skills to be rigorous through that. So we need to be careful about that. Here you've got students writing an essay. Look, what's it good about that? Well, the process was this. This was a history GCSE lesson, so it could be an RE GCSE lesson, would have been the same. In this lesson, they were doing Nazi Germany, and the teacher had said, like, here's 7 or 8 questions, and he gave them to groups around the room, and they basically said, write a short paragraph to answer that question. And they did that, they discussed it, they had to do it collaboratively. And then they said, right, read out your paragraph. So he read out the paragraph, and in reading out the paragraph, in the certain sequence, he said, like, can you see what's happened there? That was a big overarching question. Each of those subsequent questions was quite specific. And then that was a big overarching question at the end. And essentially what they'd done was spoken an essay. He said, that's the essay. That's what you do. You set the scene. Those questions did those questions did that, and that's the conclusion. And they'd heard an essay spoken aloud. And then they had to write it with their books closed. I thought it was genius because the students had to listen to what the others had said. They already knew the story anyway, but they had to sort of hear it expressed. They'd had to talk to each other, so it had oracy built in and collaborate on a paragraph. But then they brought this writing off the page. It's a great way of showing how an essay is constructed. Big picture, individual questions, and then a conclusion. So they'd heard it already spoken, and they were trying to just do their own version. It was really neat, worked superbly. And here you've got some students leading parts of lessons, which I'll come on to. So the reason I'm showing you this is that there are things which we believe in, and there are things which you feel are important. So when you're making a big choice of what you're going to teach, the values, the things you like about teaching, the things you feel an instinct that you think are valuable, are a part of that, as well as the cognitive science. One of my favorite references for this discussion about what you should teach and how comes from Martin Robinson's Trivium. He sort of talks about the ancient trivium from ancient Greece, where the trivium was the 3 arts of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And that's what Greek philosophers would have been promoting, and schools then were influenced by that. So this influenced English education right through to the Victorian age. So even when Shakespeare, for example, went to school in Stratford, he would have learnt the 3 arts of the trivium. And when he talks about the arts in his plays, this is literally what he means. He means grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. He doesn't mean music, art, and drama. That's not what the arts meant then. Now, what does it mean? Grammar, the knowledge. What do you want the students to know? What should they know? Dialectic is this how to say, it sounds like people are banging. I'm in a theatre and they're literally doing tap dancing next door. I'm sorry, it's something I can do about it. Grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. So grammar is the knowledge, the facts. The dialectic is the discussion. You've got to get students to see things from their perspective. And finally, rhetoric. You've got to get students to communicate their knowledge. What's the point of knowing stuff if I can't express it? Now, this is a recipe for great religious education. Grammar, the knowledge. What facts must they know? The dialectic. How are we bringing them into the debate? What perspectives do we then develop based on the knowledge that we have? Not just off the top of our head, not just chatting nonsense based on our prejudices and our ignorance. No, informed by the knowledge, what ways do we now see the world differently, and do other people see the world differently to us? And then how do we share that in a constructed way? So you've got to think about that. It's a great tool. If you've never read the Trivium, I think it's a must. So that's one lens. And the next lens is the hinterland and the core. Christian Council is awesome on this. We can't teach everything in RE. It's not remotely possible. There's way too many faiths, there's so many perspectives, too many texts to read, too many philosophical questions to answer. So we have to select. These are the core ideas, which if we focus on those, they'll get a good structure for what religious education is and what faith and ethics is. And then, but there's all this other stuff out there. So we tell people that there are other faiths we're not studying. We're not covering that, but we're covering this. There's some other texts we could read. There's some other parables we could study. Some other proverbs we could explore. Some other prophets we could explore. But we're going to focus on these ones because these are the core ones and the other ones are there. But we're just going to focus here. And the students are always aware that there's this other world outside that is there to be explored when they've got the time. And the link to that is this idea of cultural capital. And I wrote this in my Learning Rainforest book. This is like my list. There's all these references that we make, which, and religious education has a really powerful role here because so many references we make in sort of in discourse have a faith origin or a religious text origin. And these aren't those, but these are just other ones. And some of the time you're kind of making assumptions about things that people will have heard of, like, you know, the milk snatcher. If you don't know, that's Margaret Thatcher, and the Iron Lady is also the Margaret Thatcher. Or when people say, you know, lamb rogan gosh, Peking duck. These, you know, what are these? These are all food references. The final ball of the over, it's 6 across the covers of Deep Back, so that's cricket. You know, this isn't on the curriculum anywhere, but it's stuff we expect people to know. So one of the things that you're doing is trying to fill in the gaps the whole time. It's always worth stopping and saying, hey, here's a story. This has come up in the news. Have you heard about so-and-so? Gosh, did you see that festival over there? Because the more references you weave into your curriculum, the more aspects of knowledge and the students will encounter, even if that's not going to be on their test, you know. So never shy away from the opportunity to say, let's just fill in the gaps. And last of all, we need to make sure that our curriculum is linked. So there's some really good connections. Now I don't have an image of this for faith and ethics, but I know a school that does. I can show you that later. Here's like the development of links being made between subjects at Key Stage 3. Science connects to English. I saw a great scheme of work in a school with year 10s. They were reading Frankenstein, and they're also deliberately talking about genetics and biology, knowing that the biology and English teachers collaborated on the scheme of work. It was so interesting. What about you throwing in the whole idea of eugenics and what that means, and so on. There's so many resonances with RE and literature, so many with science and so many with history. So where those connections, and obviously with geography because of place, there are so many links. So being aware of what's going on in the different kind of silos is really, really important. And then you can start making authentic connections. If you're a primary teacher, there's nothing worse than having to say, here's a nice, neat theme. Let's just do a little bit of RE on the side to sort of tick it off to do with a theme. I think that can be quite artificial. It should be the other way around. It should be saying, like, here's the content we need to deliver in RE. What theme might help us connect it to something else, and to start with a knowledge base of the subject, not the theme being overarching. And if you start trying to artificially stick subjects to a theme, you can get really into deep water. Last thing on this, before I'm actually going to get to talk for a minute, is to keep things authentic. Now, this is again a non-RE example. I hope you don't mind, but here's a poem. Storm on the Island. It's by Seamus Heaney. It's about politics. It's about the feeling that politicians control us and we become frightened of them because they have power. And yet they're just, what are they? And what are we afraid of? And Storm on the Island literally references to Stormont in Northern Ireland. And the last paragraph here, sorry, it's just when you read this out loud, Like this is a poem which stands on its own. It's a piece of art. And if you want students to understand this, you want to read it. You want to read it out loud. You want to stand up and read it. Like it's powerful. And you've got students, I've seen this done. It's like hairs on the back of your neck, you know. Look at that last paragraph. Turn savage. We just sit tight while wind dives and strafe invisibly. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded with the empty air. Strange. It is a huge nothing that we fear. And like, you're just like, whoa, I want to know about Seamus Heaney. It's a huge nothing that we fear. That's politics. And it's great, it's powerful. Now that is not this. This is my son's GCSE anthology. Seamus Heaney. Now he had a lovely English teacher, but he never read out Storm on the Island. They were straight into annotation, ripping it to bits. It was not a poem for him. It was a piece of GCSE study material, basically, you know, and he had to learn all this stuff about it. Now that wasn't not interesting to him. It was interesting to him, but it didn't start off just being itself. So it's so important that the stories you tell and the people you reference and the things you're trying to convey are authentic, that they are vivid and real. And Hinduism isn't a load of facts on a knowledge organizer to remember for a quiz. Hinduism has a living, breathing, developing culture, faith, which real people practice and are embody. And here's one guy, and here's some, you know, images. But do you know what I mean? Hinduism is an entity that's connected to it. And the role of the knowledge organizer is to remind us of the things that we're supposed to know and think about. It isn't the curriculum. The curriculum has a life outside of that. And you can make that happen through the way you tell the stories and the way you engage people. So I've try to give you a feel of that. In my own subject, science, that's through, you know, making people excited and awestruck by the things that they learn. And before we start trying to sort of do practice questions on them. So I'm going to get you to reflect for a minute and just think, you know, just on what I've said so far. I've got, you know, another 35 minutes of things to share with you. I've said a lot to you. That's a lot to take in. Trying to sort of get this idea of the balance between rigorous, deep kind of teaching, which makes students have breaking things down in small steps and be able to understand things well and be able to explain them well and be able to remember things well, but also the values aspect of it, which is that these things have to connect at some kind of level of meaning, which is beyond just stuff you can write down. They've got to be felt and they've got to take shape in the students' heads. So you've got to get them to think for themselves. You can't just keep telling them. You've got to find out how they're expressing it. So how do you experience this? When you go into a church, how do you feel about it? When you see the animal being slaughtered, how do you justify that just because you're going to eat it? When you see, you know, how do you feel? What's that telling you? Does that make you think this? When you see that person being treated in that way, when you see Islam being represented in that way on the news, what does that make you feel? How are you relating to that? The students have got to be part of that conversation. That you can't just tell them what to think. They need to find out for themselves what they think, and then you have to have ways of them sharing that. And that's why in RE you have to have this mode A, mode B sensibility. I cannot instruct you to an understanding of perspective. I have to give you this feeling of exploration, and grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric is a more realistic way of achieving that. What's the way of getting them to explore it? So, what's your sense of that? I mean, I don't know quite what your view of this, whether you just want to carry on talking, but let's have some questions in the chat at least. And if people are saying, come on camera and ask me, or put it in the chat, and that will make it more interactive. So let's have a look at what your thoughts on what I'm saying so far. I'm actually going to make you do this because it's otherwise it's difficult. If you could just put a reflection down of some kind, a question I could ask, and let's see what sort of things you come up with. I'll pause for a minute while you do that. I do think it'd be, if someone could just put some question in the chat, that would be great. Is it me? Is it a technical issue, or just haven't? Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. If I could ask everyone to put something down, I think it's a reasonable expectation that you participate. So if you could type something in, that would be useful. Okay, we aren't just teaching facts, especially it is a real religion, exactly, and it's all religions are real to the people who follow them, and I do think it's important not to other religions. So, for example, it's quite common, and to avoid this trap, I think a good rule of thumb is this: when you're teaching RE, imagine someone of each faith that you are talking about is in the room. So it's not they; it could be one of you. Imagine someone in your room is gay in your room, because that really crystallizes on your thinking. You're not talking about other people. You're talking about, there could be students who are not heterosexual in this room, and that's important because when we get into a lot of the ethical debates around that, and this comes up all the time, I think it's so important. Imagine someone in your room is a vegan and really cares about it. Imagine someone in your room has a member of their family who may have died recently, or you know what I mean? All those things. Imagine that's all just in your room. And so you've got to teach with that sensitivity and that sensibility that we're talking about real people and real feelings. And we're modeling that in the way we talk that language. We're not talking about the other people, the other hypothetical people outside our homogenous world. We're imagining they're here in the room with us. And so we can talk about racism, we can talk about homophobia, and we can talk about ethical dilemmas as if those people were present. Thinking time. Create space for thinking. It's such a great thing. Thank you, Melissa. It's so important to have thinking time. Less is more. Now, sometimes you want to strip your curriculum back a bit and say, let's not do yet another whole run through the full backdrop to a whole other context. Let's just see if we can deepen our knowledge of this one first. And make sure the students have had time to express it, to practice explaining, to rehearse their explanations, and then apply that knowledge. I would love to adapt our lesson to fit more closely to the wider curriculum, however we are directed in our content. That's true, but I think the connections are there to be made. And in fact, I know every school has a local context. There's the sort of SACRE concept, the green syllabus is a nationwide issue. And if you're in a Catholic school, for example, you've got super strong external direction on the RE curriculum, and you'll know that. But still, you can sit with a colleague and say, like, what are the connections? And one of my favorite schools is a school called Turton in Bolton. They have this great map, and the faith and ethics, boy, it's laced in with so many other subjects. It's great. As a maths curriculum, it's often difficult to develop in teachers the confidence to know when to shift away from grammar and towards. Yeah, I do agree with that. I think some subjects, the content is less to discuss. So, but in maths, there's kind of experience of things like, at some point, you do need to say to students, see if you can find the pattern, or see if you can work out what this means. And it's more about them articulating their understanding rather than saying, I've got this whole sort of perspective. Some subjects are more contentious than others, or they're more different perspectives. But certainly dialectic can mean getting your hands dirty. One of my favorite things to do, say, for example, in maths, a thing like trying to get a feel for the sense of the angle properties. So you draw any triangle. This is one of my favorite lessons. You draw any triangle just with a ruler and a pencil, cut it out and rip the corners off your triangle and line them up. And they always make a perfect straight line, 180 degrees. And sometimes the students have learned off by heart that the angles on a straight line are 180 and the angles on the triangle are 180. But even then, when they do this and they like any triangle, any weird shaped triangle, corners ripped off, that always works. And they're still blown away by that. They have this feeling like, God, it really is true then. It's sort of that thing I've been told means something to me now because I can feel why that it will work. And they start anticipating that, you know what I mean? They're connecting the theoretical notion, this abstraction of angles, to something that they can make and handle. And there's a kind of visceral aspect to that, which makes it interesting. And there are a few golden opportunities for that in maths teaching. Sometimes it's easy to get up in red pen, green pen, absolutely. Like, I did get depressed by that. I saw a lesson not so long ago where the teacher was saying, right, everybody green pen your answer. I thought, why do we have to green pen everything? Why can't we just talk about it, Jason, what did you write? That's so interesting. What made you think of that? Yeah, that's good. How else could you develop that? Do you think other people would agree with you around the room? How many people do you think would agree with that perspective? Or do you think yours is a special? So why do you think that? It's like, great, let's talk. Let's talk. Talk counts. It's important. And then let's do the writing. So if you get stuck into book-bound learning, it can become incredibly turgid. So, yeah, the talk needs to be productive, and then you don't do it for too long. So what can happen is that the talk can lose impact because it's like hard to maintain. So you talk, right, boom, task, writing, structured note making or something. And then you punctuate your lessons. You switch between talk to writing and then discussion and then explaining something and some more talk, and your lessons have a kind of rhythm to them. Teachers who approach lessons from an or perspective rarely have behavior issues to do with, yet often teachers use behavior as the reason to avoid taking. It's so interesting. Yeah, I think this behavior, I mean, depends on context, William's saying that, but I feel like the or aspect is so, it is a way of getting students to feel connected. Now in some of the early like theoretical stuff that I presented last week, you go back to this sort of model of learning, and I reminded you this week, this model. You have to remember that learning doesn't happen through any other process except students in their own head making sense of the ideas. Now they're the ones doing the learning. You can't make a student have a particular worldview or a particular subtle understanding of a belief system and what somebody means by or kind of even their understanding of what, say, being spiritual might mean or something. They have to form their own understanding of it, and it's going to be mediated by their own experience, which is unique to them. And, I felt I'm a non-faith person, and I feel like I have a spiritual life, and I can feel that in many ways, and I could express that. And that's my worldview. I can't impose that or recreate that in anybody else. So I have to give attention to that. So it's so important to always remember that knowing facts and knowledge is so important in religious education, otherwise we have ignorance. But a true depth of understanding comes through finding the space to explore your own thoughts and then to articulate them in some way. Okay. Yeah, green pen does allow students to reflect on the responses, sure. So I'm not saying, see, it's like anything. I'm not saying green pen is wrong. I'm just saying it shouldn't dominate to the exclusion of talk. And I've met many teachers who feel like they don't feel talk counts because nothing can be seen. I've literally had that conversation. And you say, well, the stuff you're green penning, how valuable is it? So let's just get things in perspective a little bit. Thank you for contributing to the discussion, by the way. Nothing in teaching should be done all the time. So let's have a look at some specific strategies for Mode B teaching. What does this look like? Well, here's a few. In my Learning Rainforest book, I have a whole chapter of it. In chapter 9, all these have names. There's a zoom in on them. So some of these things work really well. Ambiguity and uncertainty, depend. But let me just show you a couple. So group tasks. So I've mentioned one group task already. Here's another group task, which is my son's video that he made in media studies. Now, group tasks need to be done well. So they need a good purpose. Each group needs something to do. Each member of the group, they need to have the knowledge to support the task. So for example, if you set students up to debate, say, I've seen this where some people are the genetic engineers, some people are the farmers, and some people are the environmental rights group, and they're supposed to have a debate. Unfortunately, it's in year 7, and the environmental rights group doesn't really know enough about GM crops from biology to really make a good argument. So they're basically just saying, I'm on, it's a bit like sort of City versus United versus Arsenal, you know, that's more or less what it's like. Let's argue with the other people. Do not do debates with students who don't know have the knowledge to make the argument. So you've got to make sure they have the knowledge to do the task properly, so they're not just recycling ignorance. So you've got to filter that out. But if you do that, wow, good, well-structured group tasks can be magnificent. What about flipped learning? Sometimes this gets a bad rap. Flipped learning means when you, instead of saying, let me tell you stuff, you go away and learn it, you do the opposite. You say, go away and learn some stuff and then bring it into the lesson and let's see what you did. This RE should be like really staple diet of RE teaching, I think, because children have a purpose for the reading. So everyone go, here's a couple of parables for homework. I want you to go away and read them. And the next lesson, I want you to then make the case of which one of them you think is the most persuasive in terms of making this moral case. Okay, that's the homework. Go away and read it. And you might model it. So before you go and do that, here's for example, here's another couple of parables. So let's have a parable A, parable B. So let's read that one together. Let's read this one together. Let's discuss, like do a class discussion. And then you say, oh, I think parable B is more persuasive. And these are the reasons. And you model that. You tell them what you think. You show them that you do the process. I thought about this, I thought about that. Right, so what I want you to do for homework is go and read these other ones, and I want you to do the same task then, and I want you to just write some notes about that and be prepared to share that in lessons. So next week, lesson starts. Okay, guys, so, right, okay. I have high expectations. You do the homework because we always do, and I've got standards, and you know that there's a consequence from, which is my disapproval if you don't do it. So there's no, we deal with all of that. So we just go, right, okay. First thing, turn to your partner, share what you thought about the text. Right, so Jessica, Abdi, let's have your perspective, your presentation then. Which parable did you feel was most persuasive? Fantastic, really interesting. And you model that, yes, you meant it, yes, you saw it through, and they've presented stuff to you that they briefly shared with each other, but they prepared for at home. That is doable with even younger students, but it's definitely doable with the older the students are. Pre-reading a text and presenting. You can do the same with a video. You know, go and watch this 20-minute clip about so-and-so. You know, I've seen that done superbly well. I once came home from one time, my son was listening to an audio clip of an Oxford philosophy professor giving a lecture. It was his year 9 RE homework. And he was asked to listen to the podcast and come up with some questions and prepare a kind of like a summary for the lesson. That was his homework. So not write anything then, but to deliver that in the class so that he had to listen to it and engage with it so that he could, in the lesson, do something with that knowledge. If you don't expect students to do that, then they never will. If you think, well, they won't do it, well, they won't do it. If your expectations are the limiting factor, it will never happen. So you've got to think, can I make this happen in my class? Yeah. Well, you've got to give it a chance. And then you've got to set a standard around the type of response. These are great responses. This is a poor response. So next time you do it, this is the standard. Prepare to present ideas. So Sometimes we do this in terms, so you might not do it as a whole class, but you might say, right, you have a cycle through the year, and everyone takes a turn to present. And this week we've got Jessica, Michael, and John, and you're going to present next week on the particular thing. So remember the protocol, you've got to prepare a short presentation with visuals only, so you have to speak, you have to present it to the class so they can all understand it, you've got to have some questions to ask them, and a class task. That's the deal. Go and do it, and then they're ready and they bring it to the lesson. It could be case study selection. So what's really great is when you get everyone saying, right, okay, everybody, we've talked about this. We've talked about this whole clash of cultures, of sort of science versus religion, or whatever it is, moral dilemmas, classic real life moral dilemmas where people have got trade-offs in their principles versus their kind of convenience. Or it could be famous philosophers from another country, like here, go and find one, literally use the internet and find out and present. So people bring stuff in. I love this meanwhile elsewhere. So we've just been studying Judaism, modern Judaism, and we talked a bit about Israel, and we talked about the diaspora of Jews who live around the world. But when we focus on this particular sort of situation here, 20th century, like where else was that happening? Go and find out. Or it could be a particular, just a kind of environmental issue. You'll be talking about stewardship. Go and find a particular challenging environment where a particular group of people is under pressure because of a lack of stewardship, and bring that case study to the class. Everyone goes off, and the next week you've got a whole range of wonderfully rich different examples of this thing that you've talked about. And each student feels it's theirs that they're bringing to the class. Let's sample yours, let's listen to yours. Which one did you think about? And they've gone to way to find out. Normally with some kind of structured guidance sheet to help them answer questions. You don't just say, go off and find out. You give them questions to ask and the tools to find out. So the library, the internet, whatever. And that type of thing is really, really doable. In other words, students bringing things into the lesson, a great start. Now, one of my favorite things of all time in teaching has been this, is open-ended projects leading into co-construction. So you say to people, this comes from a British Museum project we used to do, where we used to say, go to the British Museum and do a project, basically find an object and do a project. So that's, the Rosetta Stone is a great thing, do a project on that, or mummies, and the students would make artifacts and bring them in. And one of my teachers, she used to say to her class, I don't care what you do, just dazzle me. So she would say, I love that, because basically what she meant was, none of your rubbish, dazzle me. And she had examples, and the students would make beautiful things. Now that has all sorts of implications. I used to start doing that when I taught RE. I found this was incredibly powerful. At the end of a unit, let's summarize. This is a great story. So at the end of a unit, summarize the learning from the lesson. This was year 7, and my students came up to me. Some of them made a PowerPoint, some of them made a booklet, some of them made a kind of storyboard thing. These boys came up to me and they said, sir, can we make a website? And I said to them, I don't know, can you make a website? Can you make a website? They said, yeah, of course. We did it in year 4. They were really quite, I said, wow, okay, make a website. This is what they made, Embracing Islam. Hello, welcome to Embracing Islam. And there you've got, Mecca, you've got the whole thing here. And look at you can't really see this. 5 pillars of Islam, death in Islam, key characters in Islam, marriage in Islam, misconceptions of Islam. These are year 7. It was absolutely epic. Included in it, if you clicked on it, Islam is based on the 5 pillars, which are Shahada, Salah, and they've got videos of them, because they were practicing Muslims, of embedded in, showing themselves, talking about the faith practices in their own religion. It's fantastic. So it was lovely. Now, I wouldn't have made everyone make a website, but I created the opportunity to sum up our learning about Islam so far in any way you like. The next term, the same boys did it when we did an overview of Christianity, and they notched up a bit. Look, so from the award-winning creators of Embracing Islam, welcome to our second website. These boys are in year 7. And this was absolutely epic. I didn't ask them to do this. They made a whole tab called Comparison with Islam. So they had Christianity versus Islam. And online homework. Now, the online homework was for the other people in the class. So this was like quiz questions and stuff like that around. It was absolutely incredible. So now they did that because the culture was to showcase your knowledge in a deep way with high standards, but in an open way. And because they could make a website, they did. It's absolutely great. Now, I think this is really, really useful to create a culture where students can do things which is possible without being mandated. Now, I used to take this a step further. So we had this whole process in my previous school, in lots of schools I've been in, where students were used to do presentations. So in my science lessons, students used to do the practicals. So ticker tape timer, it's coming up on the syllabus. So you guys go off and it's your turn to go and do the presentation. So they would show the class the ticker tape timer. Now, how do they know how to do it? Because they read it in the textbook. I gave them like a 10-minute tutorial privately, which didn't take me that long. And they practiced in the prep room on their own. And then they came and did the demonstration really, really well. I used to do this with here. Here's Trevor explaining the pressure can. He prepared that and gave that presentation. Here's Anwar explaining the Ray box experiment. This wasn't a demonstration, this was a practical. So, okay, guys, here's the practical apparatus. Here's what you need. Now, these boys organized the equipment with the technicians. They had a responsibility for the lesson, and they gave the presentation because I expected them to. And here's Daniel explaining electron configuration. So this was a bit more of a tee up. I said, so Daniel, this boy was a very talented boy. I needed to give him a real challenge. So I said, do you fancy doing electron configuration? He went, could I? Oh, can I? Like, he was really excited. So he got the textbook. He learned about it by reading, because that's what kids can do. And he presented this brilliant thing about electron shells and how the electrons are configured. And he said, right, everybody, I want you all to draw the first 20 atoms in the periodic table, the elements, starting with hydrogen, then helium and lithium. And he went through just like I might have done, but he did it because he could, and I knew he could. And so I harnessed that. This is exciting. And you get students who can actually co-construct. Now, I elevated this to a whole thing with co-construction as teacher students, even to the point of agreeing the syllabus. So I wrote about it. Now, bear in mind, this was in a grammar school, so I was doing this, but subsequently I also developed this, done this in a comprehensive school. So I found that it could be possible here. So here's what we did, co-constructing RE. We started off by saying, let's say we're doing Christianity. So we say to the students, before I tell you what the syllabus is, ask them, what do you think we should be trying to find out about Christianity? And let's have a discussion. And the students then start, because they've learned some of the stuff before, and they start saying, we should find out about the nature of God. Marriage ceremonies, is there life after death? Their attitudes to about sin and we've heard about Jesus. What's he about? The crucifixion, Easter, blah blah blah. And this is all coming from the students in year 7, and they're making this list, and you're going, right, these are all really interesting questions. Right, let's organize that. So right, this is looking like a great set of questions, guys. This is a good syllabus. You look at the syllabus that you've got, it's exactly the same. They really, I couldn't believe this, like the questions, they knew what they wanted to find out. Right, let's do the same about Islam. What questions do we want to ask about Islam? Let's find out. They come up with all these questions, and then you look at your planned scheme of work. It's hardly any different. But there are some differences. So you say, and we're also going to do this, and we're also going to do that. So you fill in, and they feel, we helped Miss make the syllabus. And they did. And you say, right, guys, right, let's get stuck on with our syllabus that we've made. And then you get students to take some responsibility for lessons. Now, check this out. This was this thing on the right here. This is a worksheet made by Alexander in Palatine in 7S. This is a boy in year 7 made this worksheet. Similarities between Islam and Christianity with a Venn diagram. And these are some. And can you think of any other words? Write down somewhere on the lines below definition of these and put them into the correct place. So this is the list, like God, commandments, judgment. These are students bringing their knowledge to my lesson. And then we thought that, and they were designing that for their students to do as part of discussion, that they decided would be an interesting lesson. So the boys in my class decided it would be a good thing to look for similarities between Islam and Christianity. That wasn't on the scheme of work. They thought that would be interesting, and they decided to do that. Now, that is possible in education if you trust it, if you think it's valid. You don't have to direct everything, and you can get some incredible things happening. I used to have this whole thing with the mapped out, like, here's my topics for teaching science, and the students had new through this calendar. A boy made that for me. One of my students made that for me, Rad Siddiqui. He made that diagram. I didn't make that, he did. He said, okay, here's all the groups. Everyone's in the groups, let's organize it. Students can do stuff that you wouldn't even believe if you give them the chance to actually step up and take responsibility. And I think that's exciting. You get students leading lessons. One of my favorite RE lessons was a boy who did role play. He got the whole class doing role play. Like, he said, imagine being a reporter at the scene. Imagine being a reporter at the scene of the 12, the crucifixion story. What would we have seen? That was his idea. That wasn't on the scheme of work. He got everybody to discuss in pairs. We read the story. He read it bit to them, to imagine being a reporter at the scene and what we would have observed. I thought that was really interesting. And I was like, his way of getting into the story. That came from a boy in year 7. And it's just amazing what you can do when students genuinely have this opportunity to step up. So here's when I was in teaching science, this will give you a flavor. This boy called Taran, we were talking about the syllabus, and we talked about the beginning of the syllabus. Like, here's the whole specification for science. We talked about where we should start. We used to have a discussion. Where would be the best place to start, do you think? Why? Okay, let's start there then. And then what topic sequence might make a sensible order? The students used to have a say in it, and I would construct that with them. Bearing in mind, I'm quite a traditional teacher who really is demanding. And this is not soft and woolly, this is quite demanding. But we will constantly be checking, like, where are we? Where are we? Where are we? Where are we? And then one day, it was in October, I can see from the date, 9th of October, we had a lesson where I was saying, right, we better take stock because we've only got till May and the exam is, so let's just see where we are. Let's talk about. And this boy, Taran, went home that night and he emailed me. He said, sir, look, I've made a plan. Here's all our lessons that we have between now and the end of the year. Here's all the topics that we haven't covered yet. If we do it like this, I think we'll get there. And he made this plan. That's the epic. He was 15. And why did he do that? Because the culture was, we're in it together. We are a group of people. I'm the teacher, you're my students, but we are on a mission together to deal with this syllabus. So he felt this ownership, and he emailed me the plan. And so we followed Taran's plan. It was great. He even included things like CCF camp revision. So he knew that he was realistic. It was great. I mean, now you might say, lucky me, I had those great students. I did, but I also had the attitude, which was I wanted them to step up, to take responsibility. They taught bits of lessons. They led bits of discussion work. They own parts of the choices that we made, because that's the way of being very demanding of them. I could say to them, where is it? Where's your stuff? Bring the presentation, be organized. And it was exacting in that way. So I think RE is one of the best subjects for this, without any question, because there are so many choices to make, and you can create the feeling that the children have made them. You can create the feeling that the students have had some agency in deciding the questions to ask, the things they want to find out about. If you just go in with, here's the syllabus, you're doing this, well, you could do that. But you could also say, what do you think would be a good set of questions to ask about this topic? And then sort of craft it so that they feel that they've made those choices, even if really you would have probably done it anyway. They feel ownership. It's a powerful thing. So look, that's all in this context of Mode B teaching. It works because it's part of a mixture. It's not the only way you do it. Mode A teaching is the dominant. Pure disciplinary knowledge, factual knowledge, excellence in writing. I have to model that. I need to make sure they know things. I need to police the debates so that we're not having prejudice being cycled. But then I can also say, right, go, off you go, do things, bring things, be part of it, be part of this big journey. And that's an exciting way to teach. So I hope you found, now what's the split? Well, I was a physics teacher. I used to say that. It's a bit Pareto principle, a bit cheesy to be 80-20, but I'd say that was about right for me as a physics teacher. I think as an RE teacher, I'd be more like 70-30. I'd be way more towards the side of bring it, because perspective and personal experience is so much more valid in RE than it is in physics science. Forces in electricity are forces in electricity, but your perspective on a faith question is much more personal. So you've got to bring it. And the more students have had the opportunity to express that, the more likely they are to be able to do it in writing. So look, there we go. I'm going to wrap up there. I hope you found that useful. The video is going, so you can stop and do this. The slides will be sent to you as well. Thank you for listening. And thank you for inviting me to share my perspective on RE teaching. I hope you haven't found it too weird being spoken to by someone who's not an RE teacher, but I have taught RE, and I hope that resonated with you. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. That's absolutely amazing. Thank you. I'm sure everyone's going to be so grateful. The feedback from the last session was absolutely positive. So thank you once again for doing this for us.
No, it's my pleasure. I'll just stop the recording. There we go.